Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants Hangout. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I will be your host for today. Those who may have been following along for the last couple of weeks knows that we've been sticking pretty close to an ocean theme. We've really been looking and celebrating coral reefs. But today we're going to take a little departure from that, and we're going to look at sponges and sponge reefs. So I'm really excited for today's hangout. Today we are going to be joined by Stephanie Archer. Stephanie is a marine ecologist who studies the ecology and conservation of habitats created by living organisms such as seagrass beds and glass sponge reefs. In 2016, she joined the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada as a visiting fellow to work on glass sponge reefs. At the DFO, Stephanie has worked to describe the food web, species interactions, and soundscapes of the reef environment with a goal to better understand this unique ecosystem, which only occurs in the deep waters off of Northwest North American coast. So Stephanie, it's so great to have you joining us today. We're looking forward to learning a little bit more about your research. And of course, the students are going to have lots of questions for you.
Sounds great. I'm super happy to be here. So I'm going to just start sharing my screen, and hopefully this goes smoothly. All right. And then all right. Is everybody seeing my presentation all right?
We are full screen and in business.
All right. So Joe introduced me pretty well, but I'll just start by giving you a little bit more about myself. I grew up in the middle of the US, about as far from the ocean as you could actually get. And I had an amazing high school teacher who thought that just because we grew up in the middle of the country didn't mean we shouldn't know something about the ocean. And so because of him, I went off to college and got an undergraduate, master's, and eventually a PhD in ecology, focusing on marine ecology and specifically those habitats made by living things. And one running theme throughout at least my PhD and now my postdoc is sponges. So I have a question for some of the classrooms, or a classroom. Do we have an idea of what a sponge actually is?
All right, I'm going to put a classroom on the spot here. I'm going to go to Mr. Ruffin's group in Minnesota and see if they know what a sponge is.
What's a sponge is?
We do something that is SpongeBob.
I do.
A sponge is something that comes from the coral reef or the bottom of the ocean. It absorbs a lot of.
I heard it's something that grows on the bottom of the ocean. Is that what I heard?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anything else? Is it an animal or a plant or a rock or?
It's an animal that that gives other marine animals a home.
Yeah, you guys are awesome. You know more about sponges than most of the adults I talk to. All right, so you guys nailed it. A sponge is an animal that lives on the bottom of the ocean. And one thing it does is they filter a lot of water. So you can see right now this dye that a scientist is putting at the base of the sponge and how quickly the sponge moves it through its body and expels it. And these sponges, not only do they filter a lot of water, they eat really, really small things out of the water, and they do it really efficiently. So they eat bacteria and viruses and all the small things that we can't see. And they remove over 90% of them that move through the water, moving through their bodies. And so that's a really important role that they play in the ocean. So just to recap, they're animals and they're filter feeders, like I just showed. And they're sessile, which means once the babies settle on the bottom of the ocean, they don't really move. There's actually over 8,000 species of sponge in the world. And they live in every ocean, from the shallowest oceans to the deepest waters. And they also actually live in fresh water, believe it or not. And so now that we have an idea about what sponges are, I'm going to talk about glass sponge reefs, which are the ecosystem that I've been working with since I joined Fisheries and Oceans Canada a couple years ago. Glass sponge reefs are an amazing ecosystem. We've actually only known that this ecosystem exists on the planet for about 30 years. They were discovered in the late 1980s. So when I was born, we didn't know this ecosystem existed. And they're really similar to coral reefs in that they're built in a very similar way, except for these guys are built by sponges. And so this is what kind of a cartoon of what a sponge reef looks like on the bottom of the seafloor. So you have the seafloor and then a big mound that you probably can't really see when you're underwater, and then live and dead sponges living on top. And the dead sponges in this case are really important. So there's a characteristic of the sponges that can form sponge reefs that no other sponges have, and that's that they actually fuse their skeleton together so it sticks around after they die. All other sponges, their skeleton just disintegrates after they die into its different components. But the reef building sponges, they fuse it together so it still holds the shape of a sponge. And why that's important is because that's actually where the baby sponges settle onto the reef and start to grow. And then the other thing that the dead sponges and the live sponges actually do is they trap small amounts of sediment in the spaces and nooks and crannies in the reef. And that means that the sediment kind of builds and fills in all the cracks on the reef. And I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen real quick so I can show you what that looks like in real life. Oh, except for, of course, now my video is not working. Because why would that want to help?
That's okay. Let's give it a second. It seems that sometimes when we just give it a moment, it kicks in for us.
Oh, it's telling me my camera is not detected. All right, well, we won't spend too much time on that. Hold on. Now I can't get my mouse back to the right screen. Technical difficulties.
That's okay. We all know technology sometimes isn't always the most cooperative.
There we go. Okay, you seeing the presentation again now?
Yep, it's back.
All right. So what that looks like basically is that there's a skeleton of a sponge with mud packed inside of it. And so what you end up with is this big underwater structure that mostly looks like mud, except for the live and dead sponges on top. But what's actually under there are all the generations of dead sponges with sediment packed inside them. And what's really cool is these sponge reefs can be up to 20 meters tall, which is the height of a skyscraper in a small city. And they can be very, very old. So the largest sponge reefs that we know of in Hecate Strait, which I'll show you where that is in just a second, they're over 9,000 years old. And the sponge reefs are cool because they exist in a very small place in the planet. We've only known that they exist for a short period of time, but they're also cool because so many neat critters live on them. So here you can see is a rockfish. So we like to eat rockfish, and they're very important commercially here in British Columbia, where I live. You have a whole assortment of other crustaceans and fish. And this guy down here, holding up his little prize right there, is a decorator crab. And they're one of my favorites because these guys actually walk around on the reef and pick little bits of sponges and attach them to their back. And so they walk around basically wearing sponge hats. And they do that for camouflage. And another reason that sponge reefs are so important is they filter a lot of water. 1 hectare of an average sponge reef can filter an entire Olympic-sized swimming pool in 15 minutes. And so this is the entire distribution of glass sponge reefs that we know of in the entire world. So this little box up here on the top, so here we have North America, the US, and Canada. And this little box is the area that's in the bigger map. And we have sponge reefs up from the Canada-Alaska border down through what's called the Salish Sea, right down here. And I live where this little black dot is right there. So that's where I'm at right now talking to you guys. And all of these little tiny red dots that are so small you might not even be able to see them, here in the Salish Sea, the sponges on those reefs filter 1% of the water in that body of water every single day. So even though they only cover 0.2% of the bottom of the ocean in that area, they filter 1% of the water every day. It's a pretty amazing feat. And so now I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we actually study these sponge reefs, because unlike coral reefs, they actually occur quite deep. They occur way too deep for us to safely be able to go there using scuba diving or anything like that. So we have to use basically underwater robots to study them. And so we at DFO own this ROV up here on the smaller one called the Phantom. So we use that one quite often. And then every once in a while, we get to use the big fancy ROV Ropos. And this guy has, it's the Cadillac of ROVs. You can pretty much do anything that you'd ever want to do with that ROV. And what an ROV is, it's called a remotely operated vehicle. So it's connected to the boat with a tether. And then we sit inside the boat staring at computer screens, driving the vehicle on the bottom of the ocean. And so once it reaches the bottom, it goes along the bottom of the ocean taking video of the sponge reefs. And they also take still images of the sponge reefs. And we use the video and the still images that we take to study the sponge reefs. And so one major question that we have is how much sponge is actually on the reefs, because obviously they're quite important. They actually form the reefs and they provide all the homes for the other animals that live on the reefs. And so what we do is we put a grid over the still images that the ROV takes, and then we count how many grid cells contain sponge. And that gives us an answer of what percentage of the sponge reef has live sponge growing on it. And we also use the still images to look at what other critters are living on the reef. So I want to have the classrooms do a little bit of participation and take a minute and try to count how many animals they see in this photo. And when you think you have an answer, is there a way for them to maybe raise their hand or something? And
yeah, let's give them like 30 seconds and then I'll visit each classroom and see what total they think they saw.
Okay.
All right, so you're under the clock. You've got 30 seconds. Try to count the animals hiding in the sponges. I'm going to check each classroom and we'll see if somebody gets close. One of the classrooms gets close.
I should say, don't count the sponges. We're looking for non-sponge animals.
Well, I see people up on their feet. I see lots of eyes counting. We'll give them 10 more seconds. All right, hands are coming up.
All right.
Let's start visiting some of the classrooms. Let's start off with Mrs. Samuel's class. How many do you think are there?
Seven. All
right, 7 from that class.
Okay.
Mrs. Smith's class, how many do you think you see?
They see 5, I think. Yeah.
All right, I'm here between 4 and 6 from Mrs. Smith's class. Mr. Ruffin's class, what do you think?
I think that there's 6.
All right, 6. Eve's class, what do you guys think?
8.
8. All right, between 8 and 6. Mrs. Volbert's class, what do you guys think?
9.
I hear lots of 9s, 7s and 9s. And then Mr. Burney's group, what do you guys think? Mr. Burney, your microphone's not cooperating on my end. You might just want to quickly turn it on for me.
Hey, Joey?
6.
6?
Yeah, 6.
All right, Stephanie, we've heard from our classes. Lots of 6s, 9s, 5, kind of like a 4 to 9 range.
All right, so there are actually 14 animals in this picture.
14.
14. Did everybody see the octopus?
Yeah, I saw
Yeah.
that.
All right, so we've got the octopus. He's the big charismatic animal in this photo, but then we have a lot of other small crustaceans. So these guys right here, if you can see my mouse moving around, those are called squat lobsters, and they're quite common on the reefs. And then we have quite a few of those little decorator crabs, the guys that like to wear sponges as hats. And so we go through each of the images and have to try to look into every nook and cranny and see if we see animals. But we have the advantage of being able to zoom in and put our face right next to the image. And so we've got a little bit of a advantage on that front. But as you can see, it's tricky. It takes a while. And so we also have people that are much better at this than I am, thankfully, that will watch videos for us and count all the animals as they watch the video. And I say that they're much better at this than I am because I find this extremely hard. As you can see, there's a couple rockfish in the photo. There's one on the left-hand side. This is what a sponge reef looks like underwater. The sponges are tall. They're a couple meters tall in some cases. And they have little tiny crustaceans and fish living in and around them. And our challenge is to try to figure out how many animals are living on them, what kinds of animals are living on them, and if that's changing over time. Because one thing that the Canadian government has done is place protections around a lot of the sponge reefs. And what that means is that it's actually illegal to do any activity that touches the bottom around the Hecate Strait reefs and the ones in the Salish Sea as well. And that's important because these reefs, they're called glass sponge reefs because the sponges' skeletons are made of glass. And as you guys might be aware, glass is very fragile. And so if a big trawl or trap hits the bottom, these sponges shatter. And then they don't filter water and they don't provide homes for other animals. But because we've protected them, we need to know if those protections are working. And part of that is making sure that this community of animals that live on the sponge reef is the same over time, or at least not declining. And so one way that we're trying to figure out if we can monitor these reefs, that's what that means, looking at the change in the ecosystem over time, is that we're actually listening to the sponge reefs. And that might sound silly. They're underwater, they're deep underwater. Why would we want to listen to them? Well, one reason we want to listen to them is a lot of fish live on the sponge reefs. There's these rockfish that are tucked in all of these nooks and crannies here on this reef that you can see right there. And how many of you guys knew that fish can talk? It's actually quite common in fish that they use sound to communicate. And so fish that use sound to communicate often have muscles that strum on it's called a swim bladder. It's basically a big air pocket inside their body. And they strum on that and it makes a noise. And so we use these hydrophones or underwater microphones to listen to the sponge reefs and to listen to the fish that talk on them. And so part of my research is putting these hydrophones down underwater. And so this is what that looks like. This big yellow thing has the hydrophone inside of there along with the battery pack. And then this over here is actually a GoPro that we put down to see if we could figure out what was making all of the sounds that we recorded. And we're still in the very early stages of this, but what we found is that sponge reefs are noisier than the ecosystems around them. And that part of this is because they have a lot of fish calls. And this is what a fish call looks like. I wish I could play one for you, but they're very, very quiet. And we tried it earlier and it just didn't work. It couldn't transfer loud enough for you guys to be able to hear it. But I actually look at the sounds in a computer program as well as listen to them to identify them. And so you can see these very distinctive pyramid-shaped markings, and those are grunts. They sound just like a grunt that an animal might make on land, and then they make these knocking noises as well. And so I'm working with colleagues here at DFO to see if we can use this these recordings to estimate how many fish are on the sponge reefs and what kind of fish are on the sponge reefs. And so that's all that I have. as far as my presentation. And now we can just start asking questions, and I will try my best to answer them. And I will see if my camera will work again.
All right, we'll give you a second to try and stop that screen share, Stephanie. But first, I just want to thank you. That was a great presentation. Lots of really cool information about sponge reefs. I know I learned from it. I'm sure the classrooms did as well. So thanks so much for sharing that with us today.
Yeah, no problem. I'm still not getting, it's just not detecting my camera. So I'm not sure how to fix that without restarting my computer.
Okay, well, let's try. Because we still have the presentation up. Have you tried stopping the screen share? Okay, so it looks like you have now. One thing, Stephanie, we can try really quickly is there's a gear at the top. It says settings.
Yeah, it's telling me that
it's not detecting the camera.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I have one more thing we can try to get you on camera. If you want to exit the Hangout and then follow the link and come back in, that might kickstart your camera. And while you're doing that, I can introduce the classrooms and give them a chance to say hi.
Okay, I will try that real quick.
Okay, so I will talk to the classrooms while we wait to see if we can get your camera going.
All right, see you in a second.
All right. Well, boys and girls, we're just going to let Stephanie come back in and see if her camera works. But for now, I'm going to visit each classroom. I'll say where you're from and what grade you are. And then it's your job to say hi nice and loud, because then when Stephanie watches the video afterwards, she can see that part. So let's start meeting some of our classrooms. Let's start off. Let's go to Eve's class. Grade 4 is joining us in Toronto, Ontario, here in Canada. Your microphone is on. How's everyone doing? All right. Excellent job to start us off. Let's visit our next classroom. Mr. Ruffin's class, grade 5, is joining us in Rochester, Minnesota. Let me turn your microphone on. How are we doing, grade 5s? Excellent. And let's pause. That's okay, Stephanie. You know what? Don't worry about it. We saw the presentation. We saw you at the beginning. We can do the Q&A just like this.
Okay.
All right. I'm going to finish introducing our classrooms, then we'll start some questions.
All right.
Mrs. Samuel's class, grade 5-6, is joining us in Ottawa, Ontario. Let me turn your microphone on. How are we doing, Ottawa?
Hi.
All right. Next classroom joining us, Mrs. Smith's class in Burlington, Ontario, grade 5s. Let me turn your mic on. Hey, grade 5s. Hi! Pretty good, pretty good. Moving on, we've got Mrs. Volbert's class joining us from Kitchener, Ontario, grade 5-6s. Let me turn your microphone on. How are we doing, 5-6s? All right, and then last but not least, we've got Mr. Bernie's group. They're joining us from Orillia, Ontario, grade 5s. And you'll just have to turn the mic on for me, Mr. Bernie, and then let's hear a nice hi. Excellent. Awesome. Well, that's a great group of classrooms. Let's get those questions started. Mr. Bernie, since you've got your microphone on, why don't you guys start off with our first question?
Carter, can I go first? You look that way.
We're all wondering if you could tell us why you choose this job.
Why I chose this job? Oh, I was just fascinated from a very young age with everything that lives outside. I had a grandpa who had a cattle ranch in Nevada, actually, and my cousins and I would play in the rivers and ponds on the cattle ranch, catching fish and studying their behavior. And once I got exposed to the ocean and all the amazing things that lived in it, I just knew that that's what I wanted to do. And just like every natural system on our planet, there's all sorts of challenges facing keeping our ocean healthy. And so it's a very interesting job. It's a very amazing job. I get to see things that most people don't get to see, and can't think of anything else I'd rather do.
All right, great question to start us off. Thanks so much to our class in Orillia. Let's go to Mrs. Samuel's group in Ottawa, Ontario. Let me turn your microphone on. Let's see if we have a question.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm wondering how many different types of animals live in the reefs.
So that's a very good question. In the Salish Sea, we've documented over 100 animals, different kinds of animals that live on the reefs. And many of the same kinds of animals live on the reefs up in Hecate Strait, but those have slightly different animals. So I would say all told, probably close to 150 or 200 different kinds of animals besides the sponges themselves.
All right, great question. Let's see, working our way down. Let's go to Mrs. Smith's class. I'm going to turn your microphone on and then go ahead with your question.
What countries are sponge reefs in?
So sponge reefs are only found in the US and Canada.
Very cool. So they're pretty limited and pretty special for us here.
They are, and most of them are in Canada. The ones that are in the US are just along the border with Canada as well.
All right, even cooler. Let's jump to our next classroom. Let's see. Mr. Ruffin's class, let me turn your microphone on. Okay.
My question is there more than, have you gone to more areas of the ocean like the coral reef, not just the Salish Sea?
Yeah, so I did my PhD work in shallow tropical waters. So I worked on coral reefs and in seagrass beds in the Bahamas and in Curacao. The sponge reefs only occur on the west coast of Canada, and so we only study them there because they don't occur anywhere else. But I've worked in a lot of different places.
All right, let's jump to our next classroom. We have not been to Eve's class yet, so let me turn her microphone on.
Hello.
Hi.
When we use sponges to wash dishes, are they the same sponges that we can find in the sea?
That's a very good question. So originally, yes. And you can buy natural sponges to use. People don't typically buy them to use for dishes, but often in the shower or at spas and things like that. But originally, sponges were used for everything that we use a rag or a synthetic sponge for now. And the synthetic sponges that we use to wash dishes and things like that with were not invented until World War II, actually.
All right, we're getting some great questions. And then Mrs. Volbert's class, let's turn your microphone on.
Where did you find your passion for science?
Oh, that's a good question. I had really good teachers growing up, and I think that helped. I think just being outside and being curious and always wanting to know why or what else was there, and then realizing through my good teachers that science is how you do that as a job. You just ask questions about who, what, where, and why, and do experiments and design studies to try to get the answer. And can't think of anything that's more fun than that.
All right, and we've got, I can see we've got lots of viewers today. So there is a YouTube chat sidebar where you can send in questions. Let us know where you're watching from. And I've got one from there right now that we're going to take. So in Paris, Ontario, we have Mrs. Beckett's class joining us, and they're wondering if there's a relationship between the health of the sponge reefs and the health of the killer whales on the West Coast.
Oh, that's a good question. Not a direct link, but they are part of the same ecosystem. And so the big stressors that are challenging that ecosystem, like the large levels of human noise, human generated noise in the water, and the chemical pollution, those are going to be an issue for the sponges and for the things that live on the sponge reefs. We don't know exactly how much sound is an issue for the animals living on the sponge reefs, but they do communicate at the same frequencies that ships make noise. And so that is definitely a potential. But other than kind of the sponge reefs having a large effect on the water quality in the system, there's not a direct link that we know of between sponge reefs and killer whales.
All right, a great question though. I like that they're connecting the different species in that ecosystem. So good question. We're going to do a swing through and visit our classrooms again, but maybe I'll do it a little random this time. If you guys have another question, send someone up to the camera, give me a wave, and I'll know to come back and visit your classroom again because you've got another question. And that worked. I think we might have to visit every classroom. So Mrs. Smith's classroom, we'll start off with yours.
So you need to write that. Sit right there.
Oh, okay. What does a glass sponge reef feel like?
Oh, that's a good question. I've never gotten to go to a sponge reef myself because they're so deep, but I do have samples of glass sponges that have come up through scientific cores and things like that, and they're quite hard. They're a little bit spiky because they have what are called spicules, which are basically their bones, and those are made of glass and they're very small, and so they can feel kind of a little spiky, but they're quite delicate but hard at the same time.
All right, and I see someone waiting patiently at Mrs. Samuel's camera, so let me turn their microphone on.
Is there any animals that don't like it, and is there animals that like really like the sponge?
Yeah, so that's one of the questions that we're trying to answer, and I think we have a good start on the answer to that. There's these sea pins that look like white kind of whips that are related to corals. And we seem to find them only where we don't find sponge reef. So they don't seem to like growing on the sponge reefs. And rockfish and those decorator crabs that I talked about, the guys that like to wear the sponge hats, we find them in areas of healthy sponge reefs. So they seem to really like the sponge reefs.
All right, another great question. And I see someone at Eve's camera, so let me turn their camera on.
When you get like a call from a fish, how can you identify which fish it's coming from?
So that is actually a research project that we're just getting started on, and we're working with people at the University of Victoria to try to answer that question. And how we'll do it is we'll actually try to get video of the fish at the same time that we get recordings of them calling. And then we'll try to describe the properties of the fish call, so like how long it takes, the frequencies that it occurs at, and develop a species-specific description of their call. And so in other systems, different fish make different noises. And so we're hoping that we can also, that's occurring in our system too, and we can figure out which fish make which noises.
All right, so new research. And I think that's a good point to bring up at this stage too, is sometimes you hear people say there's nothing left to explore or discover, and that couldn't be further from the truth. There's still so much left for us to figure out and understand on the planet, especially in our oceans. So there's lots of really cool careers and lots of neat things that you can study if you choose to take the path of science and biology, and especially in our oceans.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Like I said in my presentation, I was alive when they discovered sponge reef ecosystems. And now we know that they cover hundreds of square kilometers of the seafloor on the Pacific coast of Canada. And they're deep, but they're not as deep as we are exploring in the ocean now. And so it's just wrong that there's nothing left to discover or explore. We don't know a lot about the ocean.
All right, let's go to Mrs. Volbert's class and turn her microphone on.
Is any of the ecosystems endangered?
As far as the sponge reefs go, I would say, yeah, there's some that are doing a lot better than others. It's hard to say whether the sponge reefs are endangered or not, because we've only known that they exist for about 30 years. And we assume that we are seeing all the ones that have existed for the past several thousand years, but we don't actually know. They could have covered a lot of the ocean, and now we're seeing the remnants of a population, but we don't know the answer to that question.
All right, and that's okay. That's why we do this study and this research, is to try and find those answers. Mr. Ruffin's class, I think I see someone there.
Yeah, yes. Oh,
now what's your favorite animal on the reef?
Oh, my favorite animal on the reef. Well, the sponges are pretty cool. I'm not gonna lie, but besides the sponges, I would say the decorator crabs. I find them very funny.
All right, to Mr. Burney, do you mind turning your microphone on for me one more time?
I was wondering if you could tell us how long sponge reefs has been on Earth, and you can tell us what the oldest one is.
Sure. So once upon a time, there were sponge reefs all over Europe. They were formed by a different kind of sponge, not the glass sponges that form the ones that we know of now. But those were around about 200 million years ago. And we thought that they went extinct about 40 million years ago. But the ones that exist now on the Pacific coast of Canada, the oldest one that we've actually gotten an estimated age for is about 9,000 years. And that one is about 20 meters deep. But there are other ones that are deeper. They're about 30 meters tall, or 30 meters in depth of the sponge reef. And so those ones potentially are much older. So at least 9,000 years for the oldest one that's still alive today.
All right, and maybe we can squeeze in a couple more questions. So let's go, I'm gonna go to Mrs. Volbert, and then we'll go to Mrs. Smith, but I think that might take our time today. So let's start off in Mrs. Volbert. Let's go to Kitchener.
What is the most common type of sponge, and what is the rarest type of sponge?
On the planet or on the sponge reefs?
On the sponge reefs.
Okay, so that depends on where you are. In the Salish Sea, which is the area that I live close to, the most common sponge is called the cloud sponge, or Afroclostes vastus. But up in Hecate Strait, the most common sponge is called Phorea aca. And so those sponges are the big white ones that you may have seen in my presentation. They kind of look like big white heads of lettuce. There's a third form of reef building sponge called the vase sponge or goblet sponge, Heterocony calyx. And those ones occur in both the Salish Sea and up in Hecate Strait. And I guess they would be the rarest of the three, but they're not rare. They make up quite a bit of the reef.
All right, and one more trip to Mrs. Smith's class.
Are there any threats to a sponge reef?
Yeah, so one big threat is anything that touches the bottom of the ocean. So when people don't know that a sponge reef is there, they'll often fish over them because a lot of animals live on them. And so things like trawling, which is where they put a big net over the back of the boat and drag it along the seafloor, that can really damage a sponge reef. And so it can deploying traps on the sponge reef. And also, not even just on the sponge reef, the sponges are filter feeders. And so when big clouds of sediment get kicked up, that can actually clog their feeding apparatus. They can stop being able to move water through them. And so that's a big problem. And so that's why DFO has put protections in place on the sponge reefs to keep things that we humans do from touching the seafloor over the sponge reefs and around the sponge reefs. Another potential threat is actually climate change. We have a colleague at University of British Columbia who conducted some experiments recently where she increased the water temperature and made the water more acidic, and the sponges, they didn't die, but they didn't like it. Their health decreased. And then after this experiment ended, she looked at the strength of the sponge skeleton and it was much lower. And so the ability to form reefs might decrease as our waters become warmer and more acidic.
All right. Well, that's exactly the question that I was going to ask is are they a little more maybe protected from climate change because they are in colder, deeper waters, but it sounds like even in those deep waters, we're still getting a little bit of temperature change.
Yeah, I would say they're more protected than coral reefs, for sure. They're not already experiencing side effects, but if the oceans warm to the extent that is possible, it could have a detrimental impact on the sponge reefs, for sure.
All right. Well, boys and girls, that time just flew by. Thank you so much for your great questions. As always, you are awesome. And Stephanie, that was an awesome presentation. And thank you so much for taking the time for great answers for all our students' questions.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you to all the students for your awesome questions. And I'm sorry the camera stopped working.
Hey, you know what? You never know what technology is going to do, and it could have been worse. We could have lost you altogether. So we'll take what we can get.
That is true. That is true. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. Boys and girls, I am going to turn on your microphones. Let's get nice and loud one more time. Say goodbye and thank you to Stephanie. Then we'll sign off for today. So here we go. All right. Thanks for a great hangout. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Hold on. Wait.